Welcome back to Differently. Today I'm having a conversation with Nicole Hagen. She's a nutrition coach and host of the Health, Wealth, and Wisdom podcast. Welcome, Nicole. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so make sure you check out her podcast. We're going to talk about it later and we'll include all the links. But I was just telling her that I've become a new listener of her podcast and I'm really, really enjoying it. And we just recorded together an episode on her podcast, which is, I think your second, you probably know the number, but
289. I just looked it up, Carla.
okay, awesome. 289, and it's How to Shed Survival Mode and Break Free. Which I think kind of leads into our my first question to you, Nicole, is we love to talk about doing things differently here. And that was one of the things that attracted me to you and your work. And I'd love for you to just give us an idea of your approach and your philosophy and how it is different.
I would be more than happy to give you the nutshell version. I really struggled with anorexia in my mid 20s. At the time I didn't know that it was anorexia. I'd never been officially diagnosed, but I have since come to learn that that stemmed from feeling out of control in my life. I grew up in a pretty idyllic family. I mean, I had younger brother, I had beautiful parents, a wonderful loving upbringing. And then in my mid 20s, I really started feeling lost and out of control. My brother started struggling with substance use. I had no tools to navigate that. And as a result, I just felt completely out of control in other areas of my life. So I was seeking to gain control. And the easiest thing for me to choose at the time was obsessing over food and exercise. So I started aggressively calorie counting. I mean, in an unhealthy way, I would calorie count everything, cutting out entire food groups that felt scary to me, overtraining. And I just really had no understanding at the time of why I was doing these things. But it was so easy for me to fall into that pattern because our society also idolizes thinness and idolizes weight loss. So at the time, I felt like I was just following all the rules and doing everything right according to, the nutrition space. Unfortunately, I went on to lose my period for several years and fracture my hip and my spine in my 20s because I was pulling from my bone density. And as a result of punishing my body with too little food and too much exercise, I completely broke that body. And I didn't have the tools or the skills that I needed to navigate everything that I was dealing with mentally and also nourish my body appropriately. So essentially, I became the nutrition coach that I needed at the time. And I didn't feel like was available. There's a ton of diet culture messaging that I, of course, subscribed to at the time, but I didn't have anyone in my life who was talking about how we can pursue fat loss, but it needs to be in a health promoting way, or how important nourishing ourselves is in making sure that we are powerfully fed in not just pursuing aesthetic change, right? Making sure that mentally we're feeling great and physically we're feeling great, making sure that we're just taking care of this one body that we're given. And that's not to say that all body composition change is evil and we should never chase fat loss or weight loss. I just didn't have any voice in my life telling me how to do that in a health promoting way. It was all really detrimental and damaging. And unfortunately, there's that old adage of like, I had to learn the hard way. And in my case, I had to learn the really, really hard way. So I've taken that unfortunate experience and tried to spin it on its head so that I can help women understand that they don't have to deprive, they don't have to starve themselves in order to create fat loss if that's what they're looking for, but also to help them juggle real life and healthy eating habits with the body composition change that they're looking for.
Wow. I didn't know that that was your story. I believe so much that our greatest gift comes from our greatest pain and wow, what an example of that you share. And not having that voice in your life. I can remember back to being like a young girl, a young teenager, and my mom would always she would always say like like kind of like watch out, like when we were eating, like watch out, like that's going to catch up with you. And I didn't realize until I was like in my 20s that I like feared this like imaginary monster like running behind me, this like fat monster that was like just going to glom onto me one day. And I had so much fear around, eating, and thankfully it didn't turn into anything major. But I just can only imagine all the women that, and men probably, that struggle with some variation of what you're talking about. And I just had a conversation this week with a young lady who is, you know, kind of afraid to. At one time she got into tracking her running and like being so intense about that she's afraid to. She wants to make positive changes with her body and her nutrition, but she's afraid to go back into those old cycles.
Hmm.
And so
I can
I
relate to that.
imagine that we have to learn to like trust ourselves, right? And trust our body and trust our wisdom. So how do you is that a core component to the work you do with people?
Absolutely. I find myself in this messy middle space because in the nutrition world, I find that there are very two opposing ends of the spectrum. You have this population of coaches and health professionals who believe that tracking is, the right way, the only way where we can be really accountable to what we're eating. And then we have this other population of coaches and health professionals that tout intuitive eating. And I find benefit in both. And I take issue with both simply because I don't think telling someone to eat intuitively is very helpful if they've never learned how to eat healthfully. I mean, what is intuitive to us is going to be what we've learned or what model was set for us
That's
growing
true.
up. And the tracking and the measuring, while it is a completely neutral tool, it depends on the motivation we're bringing to that behavior. It depends on how we've used that in the past. And so I find myself finding this middle ground. And that's why I love the podcast so much, Carla, because you can't fit all of the nuance that you need to in an Instagram caption or in a tweet or whatever we're doing now. And I find that the podcast is just such a great way to break it down a little bit more. So it is this middle space of let's understand nutrition science. Let's learn why it's so important for us to eat the right balance of protein and carbohydrates and fats and what those macronutrients do for our bodies. I love science. But then there's also an equally important side that is, well, what is your body telling you? What's your biofeedback telling you? Because what works for one person is not going to work for everyone. There has to be individuality that we take and introduce into the equation. So my clients and I work heavily on an individualized basis, and we take into account their history. So if they're coming to me with this fear of tracking and calorie counting, maybe they've weighed everything, down to the gram. We're not going to start there, or maybe we'll teach them how to do that but in a more flexible way, because what's most important to me, and I make this abundantly clear to all the women who desire to work with myself and my co-coach, is sustainability. I don't want to help you. We don't want to help you create results that are going to make you feel better for a temporary period of time, but then get you stuck back in your old cycles and your old habits. I don't think that that benefits anybody. Certainly, it's not helpful for your physical health, nor is it helpful for your mental health. It actually feels really terrible. So, what we want to do is help you create change that you feel comfortable and confident sustaining for the foreseeable future. So, if you have a curveball or life throws you an obstacle, you can still feed yourself, you can still nourish yourself, you can still maintain this healthy body composition that you've created. And so, usually, that involves a balance of some type of data collection. You don't have to use a tracking app to do that, but certainly let's figure out what a balanced meal looks like and how consistently you feel like you're eating balanced meals versus grabbing some dry cereal off your kid's plate, or stopping at Starbucks and grabbing a croissant and a latte. Like, are you nourishing yourself appropriately? We need some way to measure that consistency. And for some people, tracking is very, very helpful when used in a short term timeline. So let's figure out what you are eating enough of and what you aren't eating enough of. And let's just use this as objective data. We're not bringing shame or guilt or fear into the equation. It's sort of just like a blood panel. What information can we gather from this? Because your body's keeping record, whether or not you are. What information can we gather from this? How can we get curious about those outcomes that we're seeing or the data that we're collecting, and then apply the change that we want to make moving forward. Some women don't want to track at all because of their history, and I completely understand that. And the beautiful thing is we can figure out how to eat in a healthy, life promoting way without tracking, so you don't have to. So it's one of
Mm.
those, again, messy middle spaces that's very hard to explain to someone when they're like, but are you going to make me measure macros and are you going to make me track? I always tell prospective clients, we want you to be calorie and macronutrient aware. I want you to know like what a calorie is, that it's just a unit of energy and it's not a scary thing. And I want you to
Mm.
know the benefit and the importance of all macronutrients, but I never want you to be obsessed with them or
Mm.
feel like they control you.
That's amazing. That's music to my ears. I like even in the work that I do, it's so important to me. The sustainable change is so important to me. I don't want you to just get a few ahas. I want you to really be able to build a lifestyle that feels good living and operating in every day. Um, and to the tracking, I don't know how you feel about Noom, but I used it for a short period of time, like you're talking about. And what it did help me with was just paying attention more to, I'd never tracked what I ate or anything like that. And I was noticing that my body was just carrying more weight than normal. And I felt like I was eating healthy and I like couldn't figure out I thought something else was going on with my body. And what I realized in doing that for a short period of time is that I was maybe eating a little bit too much in quantity and not enough exercise, and that some of the things I thought were healthy weren't necessarily good things for me to be eating, and just making some minor adjustments made a big difference.
Yes, that's something that often comes from tracking. So usually my clients and I use it in a short-term intervention, and I'll say, "Hey, let's just log what you're eating." And some people prefer to not do that in an app, and that's okay. And let's just see what a snapshot, like a week in your life looks like, and they'll log, and then we'll review it together. And again, like no shame, no judgment, we're just looking at it to see what we can glean. And sometimes there will be something that they've logged and they're like, oh, I didn't realize that that contained that many
Yes.
calories, or you know what, it said whole grain or fiber on the front. I thought it was really
Right.
vegetable forward, and it turns out there's like 2 grams of fiber or something. Food marketing is very, very sneaky now. So you'll see a lot of things that say, packed with protein on the front, but it may not be a protein dominant food. And unless you know how
Mm.
to study a nutrition label, or you're using an app that kind of breaks it down for you, or you have a health professional like myself in your corner who can kind of guide you through what that looks like, it can be very, very difficult. I break a lot of hearts when I tell people that peanut butter is not, in fact, a protein and it's a fat that contains a little bit of protein, and that's just a silly example. But we
Yeah.
don't know what we don't know.
Well, I just learned listening to your podcast that like a sweet potato isn't necessarily better than a white potato. And like that was really enlightening because for whatever reason in my brain, somewhere along the way, I thought that was a much better choice. And that was really enlightening to hear and kind
Carla,
of
it is one
freeing.
of my favorite things that I get to do when I tell people that like the fear mongering that diet culture has kind of impressed upon us is completely unnecessary. And a lot of it stems from, conventional diets like the paleo diet. They subscribe to sweet potatoes as being like the only carbohydrate that you can eat. But for whatever reason, all other carbohydrates, even though they're all giving your body energy, and many of them, those what we call smart carbs or complex carbohydrates, give you the same nutrients and the same energy, for whatever reason have been deemed bad. I'm using air quotes because we don't really like to use food morality around here, but it's wild. I work with grown women who are petrified of eating bread products or of adding creamer to their coffee or to eat a white potato, and for no reason.
Wow.
Nutritionally, it's giving you something, and even if it's not giving you something nutritionally, it's okay to eat things just because they give you something, emotionally, or because they add pleasure to your cup of coffee in the morning.
It's so amazing. I love that approach. So you talked about kind of taking the landscape by doing some tracking initially, and I think we talked about this on my episode with you. But I do that with clients just to we sort of log their thinking for a week to get the landscape of our mind. And so I'm curious, what are some of the mental mindset things that you see over and over again that we need to look at or address when it comes to really shifting our approach in a healthy way in the area that you work in?
Mm. Okay, so the first one is very easy. It comes to mind really quickly when you ask that question. And that is how we look at food and nutrition with regards to all or nothing thinking. So I would argue that this is probably the thing that I see women struggle with the most, because somewhere along the line, probably diet culture introduced to us this concept of eating perfectly, which is a complete fairy tale, right? It doesn't exist. No one can eat perfectly. It's just not a thing. There is no perfect diet or one right way to eat. But so often, I think we struggle with nutrition because we feel as though we've messed up by enjoying a cookie or having a piece of having a sandwich that uses two pieces of bread instead of just one piece of bread. Can you imagine? And so we have these stories in our head that when we do X, we have fallen off the wagon, so to speak. And then we go down what I call, I don't know if you encourage explicit language, but the fuck it spiral or the shame spiral. And we're like, oh my gosh, I've ruined everything. What's the point? I might as well now just go full speed ahead,
Right.
eat all the things that I quote can't eat, and then I'll start again on Monday or I'll start
That's
again
so
tomorrow.
true.
An age old story. This is so, so popular. And I think what we want to remember is there is no wagon, there is no starting or stopping. Like, you are going to have to eat from the day that you're born until the day that you die. Like, nutrition is something that we have to have developed flexibility for. You're never going to just eat perfectly because that's a made up concept.
Mm.
So I think that's the
Wow.
first like self talk
Mm.
cycle that we get stuck in that we have to become aware of. And it happens all the time. Maybe I, had an unexpected errand to run, or I had to go pick up my sick kid from school, and so my best laid plans kind of got, destroyed, and so I ended up just having to grab something quick on the way, or I just ended up grabbing a granola bar, and then I was super hungry, so then later I overate my dinner, or I ended up eating the leftover chicken nuggets off my kid's plate, and that didn't feel great. So now I've really ruined it, right? I've ruined all my progress. When in reality, every choice that you made up until that point still counts, right? Like, you can still get all of the benefit from eating, beautifully. And it's okay if we're not perfect, and there's some flexibility and there's some pleasure and there's some convenience based choices moved in there. I find that most of the time it's not actually what we're eating that unravels our progress. It's the story we tell ourselves about what we're eating and then the behaviors that result from that. So if I feel like I've ruined everything, then the next 3 days are going to be off the rails. Whereas if I was like, oh, okay, that happened, that didn't feel really good for me, I know it also wasn't super goal supportive, let me pick myself back up, wipe the slate clean, and then make a better choice the next time I eat. That's like
Yeah.
first and foremost what comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean it parallels with what I teach clients too, like when your thinking goes off the rails, right? And it's like they get so focused on the fall, right? Kind of falling away from this good channel of thought management that they were on. And what's most important is not that you fell, but that you get back up, right? And just keep going again with those small little choices, because those over time do ripple to those larger changes, and it's so vital. So it sounds too like there's a shift in relationship that happens with the way that we think about food in our lives, and being like almost being like a partnership. And it's terrible because we enjoy eating. It's such a social, beautiful, connecting activity in our lives, right? And so I love that you bring this approach of like bringing more joy, releasing pressure around this, and bringing more enjoyment back to it. So anything there that comes to mind around like mindset in shifting that relationship?
Mm, I think it's the role that we give food. And I mentioned earlier, sometimes we start to view calories as a bad thing because we've been taught that being in the lightest, leanest body possible is like what our job is as a woman, right? We're meant to be socially desirable. And that means, whatever the standard is of beauty. Now we're reverting back to heroin chic, which was a big thing when I was growing up in the 90s. It's unfortunate because it does not value health, right? We're just valuing thinness and we're valuing that number on the scale, which weight and health are not the same thing. Sometimes they're correlated, but not always. And I think it comes down to understanding the impact that we're giving food. Food is not just fuel. Yes, a calorie is a unit of energy, and food does give us energy. Actually, just this morning, I was getting ready for my coaching calls, and I heard my husband chasing my toddler around because he's in the stage right now where like he refuses to sit down for a meal. And, he's got too many things to do, too many adventures to go on. So my husband's chasing him around with, his breakfast. Like, we need energy to do those somersaults. We need energy to play with those trucks. And it was just interesting to me because that's just off the cuff language for him. Like, yes, food is energy. That I want my son to know that if he wants to feel his absolute best and he wants to have energy to do whatever adventure he's going on, he does need food. He needs some energy. But it's not just energy. It's not just fuel. And I think the gas in the tank is an oversimplified analogy. Food is also, like you mentioned, community. It's culture. It's fun. It's pleasure. It is a coping strategy when we're dealing with hard or happy emotions. Is it a coping strategy that's awesome when we use it for every single emotion we have, be it positive or negative? No, that becomes a slippery slope. But is it okay to celebrate feeling happy at a birthday party with some cake and ice cream, even in the absence of hunger? Absolutely, yes. Is it okay to maybe navigate some stress or overwhelm with a delicious sugary snack? Sure, yeah. As long as you have other coping strategies in your toolbox, if you are intentionally and mindfully making that choice, knowing how it's going to leave you feeling, that's just human. That's human behavior. And so I think we need to learn to embrace that food is more than just fuel. And that kind of changes the expectations surrounding why we eat and when we eat and how much we eat. Did that answer your question? I feel like I kind of got off on a rabbit trail
Yeah,
there.
no, I know. I think it did. I think it did. As you've been talking, I know for myself that sometimes there's so much information out there that I just literally will like shut down because it's just too much and then I get overwhelmed. And so do you have a simple strategy for someone like me?
Actually, this is too funny, Carla, because I just created a post. Was it earlier this week? Because of a coaching conversation that I have. And she was saying the same exact thing. She was struggling with information overload. And she just said, there's so many things. And when it comes to the internet, there's so many conflicting things where it's like,
Yes.
you should eat meat and then meat is the worst thing ever. Or like dairy is inflammatory. No, dairy is really great for you. Or vegetables are wonderful. And then you have the keto and the carnivore people that are like, no, don't eat vegetables. It's terrible. So it's one of those things where like you can go insane if you subscribe to every piece of nutrition advice that you read on the internet. There are a couple like fun little quirky things that I like to remind people, like if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If it's coming from someone that has like zero credentials or zero credibility and they're just telling you it works for you because it worked for them, that's probably a red flag. The most accurate advice is usually the most boring advice. So if someone is saying like, "Oh, I've got this magic elixir that's going to heal your hormones," or like this is really the secret to reducing insulin spikes, like those things sell because they're sexy. They feel appealing and attractive. But oftentimes, the most evidence based advice is what feels not big enough or not sexy enough or not shiny enough. Like those big rock basics is what my team and I call them. You have to make sure that one, you're eating enough. Quantity is king when it comes to feeling, looking, and performing your best. So it's finding this middle ground of eating enough, but not too much. And we can narrow that down by learning how to hone into our hunger and fullness cues. A little hunger is totally fine. It's a normal physiological response. It's not something to be afraid of. But that doesn't mean allowing ourselves to get ravenously hungry and denying our bodies food for hours and hours and hours. Quantity is king. Then we have, are you eating enough of the right things? So I mentioned those three macronutrients, the big nutrients that all of our foods break up into: protein, carbohydrates, and fats. Are you eating a balance of those? Research shows us that our bodies want all three of them. There's no reason to cut out a food group unless it does not agree with your body or you have an allergy to it. So
Wow.
if you are eating primarily carbohydrates, you're going to struggle because our bodies want protein and they need healthy fat. If you are cutting out all carbohydrates, you're probably not going to look, feel, and perform your best because carbohydrates are our body's primary source of fuel. So we want to make sure you're eating enough, period, from a caloric energy intake standpoint. Then we want to make sure you're eating enough of the right things: protein, carbohydrates, fats being those macronutrients, but also micronutrients. Are you eating fruits and veggies? Like, are you getting your vitamins and your minerals from the food that you eat? Are you eating mostly whole foods, which is where we get those micronutrients comparatively to the convenience-based processed packaged foods? And I'm not against convenience-based processed packaged foods, but if 90% of your diet is that, excuse me, it's going to be hard to get enough micronutrients.
Mm.
So those are kind of the two areas where I always suggest starting, because nutrition by addition feels better than saying, oh, you should cut out the cookies and the ice cream. You should cut out your alcohol. By making sure that you're eating enough of those things, you're more likely to reduce the other things that you don't need as much, but give you a lot of joy and pleasure.
Mm. I resonate so much with your approach, and thinking back to what you said, that the boring choices and the not so sexy information is probably more right on. And it reminded me, I saw a post that said self care is discipline. And I loved that. Like, because the whole self care, like, I don't, that conversation kind of makes me squirm a little bit, because I do believe that like real self care is discipline and making those choices that like really align with your larger commitments. And self care is sometimes the boring things that make the biggest difference.
Absolutely. And I find too, self care, oftentimes we think of it in terms of like the bubble bath and the manicure and those things are wonderful, right? I'm not
Right.
saying that
They're
I will
great.
turn down a massage if someone is
Yes.
offering me one. But I also think self care, like in its truest form, is taking care of ourselves, which sometimes means doing the thing that we don't feel like we want to do, that allows us to care for our physical or our mental health, right? I don't always love going to therapy, but I do know that it's great self care. And in the long run, I'm going to be better for it. I don't always feel like going to the gym and doing a workout or having a healthy, balanced meal. Sometimes I would really just love to sit down with a bag of chips, but how is that going to leave me feeling? And I think if I'm mindful and can be proactive in thinking about how I'm going to feel, not just 5 minutes from now, but 15 minutes from now or 3 hours from now, oftentimes the best self care choice is maybe the harder, less like pretty self care choice.
Yeah.
I know
Yes,
that's not going to
yes,
get me popularity
yes.
votes, but
That's okay. Um, so speaking of sort of rhythms and rituals of that nature, do you use we like to talk about journaling around here, as you know. Do you use any sort of journaling inside of the work that you do with clients?
yes. So I think it depends on the client first and foremost. So we don't
Sure.
have like a 12-step program where it's like, okay, everybody has to do these 12 things in this order. I don't really think that that works for a lot of people because everybody's starting at a different place. Everybody's coming from a different place
Mm-hmm.
with different backgrounds. So I find that there are two journaling strategies that I use in my work that have been wildly successful. One is for the woman who has a really hard time connecting with herself and maybe lives neck up. So she lives in
Yes,
her
yes,
headspace. She
yes.
knows what she should do. She is very educated, has a ton of knowledge, but really doesn't know how her body feels. I can resonate with this woman. I spent a lot of my life here trying to do
Me
like
too. That's why I
the
teach
right
it.
thing. Yes. Yeah. I'm going to follow the rules and I'm going to do what everyone's expecting me to do without really pausing to ask how it feels for my
Mm.
internal world and how it feels for my body. So, in that regard, I think journaling can be super, super helpful for that woman to become a little bit more introspective and to really connect the neck. So, she's figuring out how to make choices from her body as opposed to just what she knows. And sometimes that might look like a Dear Diary type entry. And sometimes it might just be, hey, can you like maybe just write down your self talk for the day? Like, how are you talking to yourself about food or about your body? When you first look in the mirror, you get dressed, like what are the words and the phrases that you use or that go around inside your head? So she gets to know more about herself and how she feels. Or how did you feel after you ate that thing? or if you make a choice that you feel like was bad, can you write down how it left you feeling afterwards and maybe what you do differently next time? I find that that can be wildly beneficial.
Yeah.
Then I find that there's another group of women who maybe need a little bit more structure because they're stuck in the overwhelm. So they've got a lot going on. There's a ton of conflicting nutrition advice, like we mentioned earlier, and they need to really like narrow their focus so that they can stop kind of spinning their wheels and actually make forward progress. And for this, I like a like 3 priority checklist for the day type journal
Mm.
suggestion, which is like, okay, you probably feel like you have 17 things to do in the next hour. And you probably do. But what are your top 3 priorities for the day? And one of them must be some like nutrition centric or self-care centric priority. So the other ones might be like, I have to take my kid to, this field trip, or I have to get this done from a work perspective. But what do you have to do today in order to make sure your cup is filled and you're able to fully show up, that has to do with you and your fueling and your self-care? And I think that that's so helpful because after you check off your list, you can go do the other 17 things or the other, 14 things.
Mhm.
But until those things are done, no, nothing else matters. So it's
Mhm.
teaching that woman to value herself and prioritize herself, where so often she puts herself on the bottom of the list. So she never actually makes the priority list because the other 16 things have to happen first, according to her. So in this regard, it's teaching her that she's just as important, if not more important, than those other things on her priority list, and her health and how she feels in her body matters. So those are the 2 things that I find myself kind of giving clients as like a little homework assignment
Mhm.
more often than not.
Yeah, those are great. Those are great. You've shared so many gems here. Is lastly, is there, a lot of people that listen to this podcast and that I work with struggle with time. There's just kind of like what you're talking about. There's so much, right? And so it's like how, especially if you're juggling motherhood and a business and all the things, what is your recommendation for starting to carve a little bit of space when you're feeling like that? Like there just isn't time for adding anything or even changing anything. I think sometimes they feel overwhelmed by that.
Mm. This is a tricky one because it's like so individually based. I want to
Mhm.
ask 5 more questions, right? Of like this hypothetical person.
Yes.
But I think first and foremost, what comes to mind is like keep it stupidly simple. So you're going to
Mm.
eat something anyway, I imagine, right? Many of us are going to make time to have something to eat. So instead of having whatever you would typically have, can you stock up when you're at the grocery store on things that are just as convenient and just as easy to
Mhm.
grab, but maybe will give you a little bit more of a robust plate? So oftentimes we think we have to like become the next uh, whoever's cooking all the stuff in their kitchen homemade. Nara Smith is like very popular right now on TikTok and Instagram. I don't want to spend more time in the kitchen than I absolutely have to. I mean, I have a toddler to run around after. So
Right.
keep it so simple. Like get a rotisserie chicken or get some like frozen shrimp, or have some hard boiled eggs that you like made up while you were doing something else in the kitchen, or grab like a ready to drink protein shake, right? Like there are so many options that are so quick and convenient that will not take you any more time, but you're not choosing them because in your brain they're not good enough. Like it's not the
Mhm.
homemade lunch that you think you should be making, instead of that like
Wow.
quick sandwich and chips. Like grab something that's just as simple and let good enough be good enough. I think that would be my
Yeah.
very first suggestion. Secondly, what comes to mind is like use the time that you do have. Oftentimes, again, the problem is, oh, I'm not going for that 10-minute walk because I feel like it should be a 30-minute walk or a 45-minute workout. And I don't have time to go to the gym. Okay, don't go to the gym. You don't have to do that. Walk around your block with your dog once or twice throughout the day. Or I'm not going to, food prep because I don't have multiple hours to prepare everything in advance of the week. Cool, me either. But can you make a dozen hard boiled eggs? Or can you make a pan of like ground up turkey or, ground beef that you can then use in tacos or on salads or in like something else throughout the week. It can be so simple. You just have to,
Mm.
once again, use the time that you have. I always like to say, make the best choice you can given your circumstances. I don't want you to be anyone that you're not. I'm not asking for your life to completely change, but can you use the time that you have and make just a slightly healthier choice that's going to leave you feeling a little bit better? Those would be my suggestions.
That's amazing. And I hear so much just willingness to be flexible and creative and adapt, and it doesn't have to look the same every day, and but there's like a desire and a commitment to fold it in somewhere however we can. And I love that. I love that. Nicole, this has been amazing. Is there anything that you didn't get to say that you wanted to say before we close?
Oh my gosh, I could talk about this all day
I
long. I'm
know.
a bit of a nutrition nerd, so there's lots that I could say additionally, but I would say if this is a conversation that's interesting to your listeners, let's continue it. I mean, hop on over to Instagram. You can find me at Nutrition with Nicole, and I am constantly talking about all things nutrition and mindset and just sustainability. And of course, the podcast is where I love to hang out and release a weekly episode, the Health, Wealth, WELLTH, and Wisdom podcast. And I'm happy to, field any questions. I am not popular enough to have someone else in my DMs answering questions. So it's always me that you're talking to. Send me a question. Let me know what you're navigating, and I will gladly respond.
I love that. I love that. And your podcast is such a great place where you dive deeper into all these little things. So if you heard something that you want to go deeper, she probably has an episode related to that on the podcast. So thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing all your wisdom and just energy and passion for what you do.
Thank you for having me. And for anyone who doesn't know where to start in the almost 300 episodes we have on the podcast, start with episode 289 featuring Carla and I's
Oh,
conversation.
it's not what I thought you were going to say, but that's awesome. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you, Nicole.